Welcome to this Carbon Trust event, Accelerate to Net Zero Africa. We've got some great speakers today from leading organisations who are going to tell us about their journey to net zero, including De Beers, Vodacom, Nedbank, Old Mutual Investment Group and many more. We're going to hear about the challenges and successes that we all face up to and the impacts of climate change. But also we'd like to hear from you. So you should have answered a poll. Over on the right hand side of your screen, you'll see a box which has got all of the resources that you need today. So I'll give you a moment to answer the poll. But which location, which city, where are you joining us from today? As the events go on, you can ask questions of the speakers, particularly our keynote speaker who's up next. You'll find the Q&A section in that box on the right hand side. And you can also answer more polls on the platform as they pop up. You'll find resources to download and contact details for the Carbon Trust team if you want to talk to them afterwards as well. There's also translation, so there's captions if you want to have English captions, or if you want translation into French or many other languages, they're also available on the right hand side. Our mission at the Carbon Trust is to accelerate the move to a decarbonised future. With over 400 experts around the world, we help leading businesses, governments and financial institutions accelerate their route to net zero. We've played a central role in establishing the standards and measures that many of these organisations use today. We've also supported the development of new technologies and programmes that are leading the way in the global response to the climate crisis. We all know the clock is ticking. I'll say that again. We all know the clock is ticking. If you joined us last year, you might remember this event was called the Route to Net Zero, but this year we're calling it Accelerate to Net Zero, and for good reason. This event is part of a global series, so if you're interested in our work in Latin America, Europe or elsewhere around the globe, make sure you check out our website at carbontrust.com and find out more about the other events. The Latin America event is this afternoon, or later on this afternoon I should say, and also look out for the videos from the other events from Europe, UK, China and elsewhere. Now let's have a look at the results of the poll. Great, so I can see many of you from Johannesburg, where our office is, also Ethiopia, Alberton, Harare, Kenya. Some fantastic places there. Thank you for joining us wherever you're from. And now I'd like to introduce our CEO, Mr. Tom DeLay.
Hello, my name is Tom DeLay and I'm Chief Executive of the Carbon Trust. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event. Accelerate to Net Zero Africa. We've had a presence in Africa for a number of years. It's built gradually over time, and I'm delighted that we're able to work with so many key partners and clients across the continent. Coming back to the Carbon Trust, we're an organisation with one mission: to accelerate the transition to a decarbonised future. Accelerate is the verb. It's what we're here for. It's to do more than is just required, to really push ahead and accelerate that transition, however hard we know it might be. We deliver impact through the success and ambition of our clients and partners worldwide. We work with our clients and partners either directly, helping them with issues specific to their organisation, or more broadly by driving and supporting collaborations that can go across from public to private sector, or indeed across whole industry sectors, looking to make progress and share in that progress so that individually organisations can then go ahead and build their future routes to net zero. Being practical is what we're all about, and that's what today's event is all about. Making Route to Net Zero something that is tangible and real for your organisation and helping you think about it in that way. We're going to have a number of panels, we're going to have a number of talks, but we're also going to have an opportunity for you to contribute directly, to interact with what is going on today, not simply be passive. And please, I would ask you to do that. It will be a better event if you do. So that's all from me right now. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I look forward to the rest of the event. It should be a great success. Let's hope you can help make it so. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Now it's time for our first keynote. The Presidential Climate Commission is an independent body established by President Cyril Ramaphosa in 2020. Its focus is the delivery of a just transition towards a low-carbon, inclusive, climate-resilient economy and society in South Africa. Dr. Crispian Olver is the Executive Director of the Presidential Climate Commission, and he's responsible for the running of the Secretariat of the PCC and its various policy and research programmes. He served the South African government in a variety of capabilities and has been intimately involved in South Africa's climate policy and environmental legislation. He's an author and he's also a medical doctor by training. We'll be taking questions at the end of the session, so if you do have any, use that box on the right-hand side. Dr. Olver, welcome, first of all, to Accelerate to Net Zero Africa. It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
And I'm going to give the stage to you. I believe you've got some slides as well, so I'm looking forward to your talk. We'll be back shortly with questions.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be able to talk to you, and certainly on a subject as important as net zero and how we transition to net zero. And just by way of context, obviously the mitigation journey is very important for us. But what we are talking about really is three interrelated transitions. There's the decarbonization journey that we have to go through. There's the process of building our adaptation and resilience. And there is the just transition, making sure that these major shifts that take place in our economy and our society work for everyone. And putting it very simply, in South Africa, we're trying to move in 2022, 2023 from a very high vulnerability, a very low productivity, carbon-intensive economy with a weak public sector and very high degrees of inequality, poverty, and unemployment, into an economy and society that are more resilient to climate risks, that have managed the transition to net zero successfully, and that are growing investment, building the competitiveness of the economy, and of course enabling the state to deal with the levels of inequality and unemployment that we have. The thing that's sort of occupied the minds of decision makers in the last few years. I mean, we all understand the moral imperative to decarbonize. But what's become increasingly clear to us in the last few years is the economic risk that we face from a highly carbon intensive economy. And, just to put it a little bit into context, I mean, we are I think it's fair to say we are the most carbon-intensive economy in the world. We're almost double that of China's. We're 2/3 higher than that of India's. And as the world starts to inject a carbon price into the global trading system through one or another mechanism, if it's not CBAMs, it's going to be some other forms of restriction, we are in danger of having our products severely penalized and ultimately shut out of the world market. So South Africa signed on to a fairly ambitious emissions trajectory that's captured up to 2030 in our nationally determined contribution. And I've put up there, on the slide, is an indicative emissions trajectory. This is modeled on a 9 gigaton budget. We see the period now to 2030 basically as a foundation phase. We used to refer to peak, plateau, and decline. In fact, we've already peaked and we're plateauing and starting the decline in this decade. And the heavy lifting is going to come in the 2030s. So, between 2030 and 2040, we're going to have to achieve a major reduction in CO2 emissions, principally from the energy sector. I mean, it's no secret we're a highly coal-dependent energy system. We basically build power stations on top of coal mines and generate power from that. And you can see the trajectory down to 2050. It doesn't go to absolute zero. And I have to say, I mean, this idea of net zero by 2050, it's a very useful mobilizing tool. And we've used it a lot as the Climate Commission. But in fact, the issue is not so much when we get to net zero. And it may be by 2050, it may be a little bit later. We may get there by 2055 or 2060. The operative thing to focus on is the area under the emissions curve, what we refer to as the carbon budget. And that's in fact where most of our modeling is now focused, is on determining what is a technically and financially and development-wise a developmentally feasible carbon budget for us to work to. And I'm presenting here, this is modeling that was done by the National Business Initiative. It was a really important modeling exercise done in partnership with BCG. I'm sure you're familiar with them. So they came up with an aggregate carbon budget to 2050 in the range between 10 and 12.7 gigatons of CO2. Others, the World Bank has just completed the Country Climate and Development Report. They based all of their modeling on a 9 gigaton budget, so a little bit more ambitious. And I'm aware that there are some even more ambitious trajectories that have been put forward. But the debate is not just about the aggregate size of the budget. It's also about how we divvy the budget up between the different economic sectors. And by far the lion's share goes to the power system in this country. And then you can see ranges that are projected for petrochemicals, mining, the Afolu transport, heavy manufacturing, buildings, etc., and a sort of provisional reserve for economic diversification measures. So that's the budget debate. Whatever trajectory we sign onto, there is going to need to be fundamental transformation in both the power and the transport sectors. And I guess the good news for us is that because of the coal dependency of our energy system, it's the one place, I mean, it's probably globally one of the areas where we can get the cheapest emission reductions. And that's going to be driven by a massive rollout in renewables. That's already well underway in the country. We've lifted the cap on embedded generation completely, and households and businesses are now very rapidly putting their own power systems in place, basically renewables and batteries. And similar thinking is happening in terms of the national grid. We've been in a process of talking very widely. I mean, part of our function as a commission is to engage stakeholders. So, we talk to everyone: business, organized labor, civil society, government, of course, young people, church, faith-based community, local government. And they're all giving us a very, clear message, particularly on the energy system. So, in addition to decarbonization, people are worried about energy access and affordability, energy security, system stability, jobs and skills and the just transition, and economic development and diversification. And I'm reminded by this energy trilemma that the World Energy Council put out in their latest report, where they talk about this balance between environmental sustainability, energy equity, which is really about ensuring that the poor and rural communities, the most disadvantaged in our society, are able to access at least a basic level of energy. And then energy security, which is really about our national capacity to meet current and future energy demand reliably. Now, all these modeling exercises I've referred to, and there's some not mentioned in this graph, come up actually. I mean, listening to the South African debate, you'd think that we're completely at 6s and 7s about the energy mix. But in fact, all of the thorough modeling and research comes up with a very similar kind of energy mix, which consists of renewable energy generation, storage, that's batteries and pumped hydro, some grid balancing with gas-fired peaking plants, and of course, major investment in our transmission and distribution grid. And the real difference between the different scenarios is the budget, the carbon budget that they operate in terms of, and the budget drives the pace of implementation. So the differences in the investment numbers, and these are you can see the figures where I've got them for the carbon budgets associated with the modeling exercises. So you can see the figures associated with the different kinds of budgets and the pace that's attached to it. And interestingly, our national utility, Eskom, comes up with a very similar set of recommendations. So, this is their assessment of the full power mix, particularly in the context of the current crisis. Again, looking at PV, wind, gas, nuclear, and new coal. And, they were looking at what's the build time, what's the levelized cost of electricity, and what are the other risks. And, unsurprisingly, new coal comes out at the bottom of the decision-making tree. Nuclear is technically feasible, but it's a long time away, 12 to 15 years. And, again, there are some serious cost issues. And it's really at the end, PV, wind, gas, and they haven't put it into this graph, but the storage that I've referred to that really make up the total energy mix. The other thing to think about, when we talk about net zero and carbon budgets and the different kinds of scenarios, is also what the aggregate growth impact is. And this is modeling, again, from the World Bank. So this is their country climate and development report modeling that they did for the country. And they were looking at the annual growth impact of different scenarios. So there's a gray band, the reference 9 gigaton budget in the middle. It's that straight line in the middle. That's the reference range. Then, if we add greater ambition, it pushes growth quite considerably down to below -3, -4% by 2030, and we only get back to the baseline by 2050. You can increase that with higher foreign savings. So you can get a better growth lift by 2040 and 2050. You can increase it further with certain additional policies and measures. And the big game changer there is energy efficiency and demand side management. And you can increase the growth impact further if the green H2 strategy that our country is pursuing seriously if we're successful in that. So the best growth impact is a steady decarbonization process with policy measures and going for the green hydrogen export scenario. And that's very importantly linked for us to jobs. And if we're going to talk about just transition, then we have to talk about aggregate employment in the economy. And there's good and bad news on the jobs front. I mean, on the positive side, and this is the graph on the left that comes out of the NBI Just Transition Pathways modeling work. There's a net aggregate jobs positive effect from an accelerated decarbonization process and a rollout of renewable energy. The problem is that those jobs are in different places in the country. They're not going to all be in Mpumalanga. They require different skill sets and they're in different sectors. And there is a time lag between some jobs and others. And I've shown on the right-hand side some of the modeling that the World Bank did on particular sectors and the employment impact. And you can see a real positive impact in platinum, in other metal ores. We've got an excellent mineral resource for the future green economy, on hydrogen, fuel cells, electrolyzers, and of course big losses in areas such as chemicals, coal, petroleum, and other chemicals, although both on the sustainable fuels and the chemical side, there are some job positive effects. And that's why we talk in this country about a just transition framework, because our crucial concern is to make sure that there's an equitable distribution of risks and responsibilities, and that we're not making workers and poor communities linked to the fossil fuel value chain carry the costs of this transition. So we've developed a just transition framework for the country, and it's built on a number of planks. The first is industrial policy, actively localizing, renewables, battery manufacturing, EVs, green H2 minerals, and using public procurement to drive that change. Intervening actively in the labor market around skills development, lining up the basic and higher education systems, and putting job placement and employment incentive schemes in place. And then for those workers that we cannot transition into work, putting the social support mechanisms in place. First of all, making sure that the basic services, healthcare and human settlements are available, building community resilience and putting in place income support for displaced workers. And that might include early retirement provisions. We've also set out a range of governance mechanisms, and I'm not going to focus on all of them, but particularly in Mpumalanga, ensuring that there's a regional development mechanism. We've set up what's called a green cluster agency in Mpumalanga. We're coordinating with the province and various national departments around an economic development strategy for the province. There's also, a substantial cost to this, and you've probably been seeing, the various estimates that have been put out. It's a little bit confusing at times. The World Bank CCDR report comes up with an aggregate figure of 8.3 trillion rand to 2050. It's a huge number. The JET IP focuses on our costs over the next 5 years, and it's a little bit more easy to get your head around that number. And we've got to look at all of the sources that we can mobilize to finance this transition. So, the bulk of it's going to come from domestic savings. Basically, we've got a very well-developed pensions fund system and a very, well-developed set of capital markets. Clearly, the state needs to come to the party with some of the resources, although it's highly constrained. We've been talking to a number of development partners, and you've undoubtedly heard of the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, the $8.5 billion, which is in the final process of being finalized. Some of it's already started. And then there's philanthropic capital, which has been standing very firmly behind the South African transition. So, the JET IP, I'm sure you've already heard about. It projects an amount of 1.5 trillion rands over the next 5 years. So the 8.5 is contributing to that investment plan. It's not the total amount that is required. And we're in the process of raising the remaining amount of funds. And that's principally going to go on upgrading the grid, putting the other enabling reforms in place in the energy sector, starting the work around new energy vehicles, and starting to tee up the hydrogen economy for the country. And what we're working on as well with Eskom and the JET IP team is also how to localize that spatially. So looking at where on the grid we have existing capacity that we can procure energy for, and focusing the procurement process on those packets. So that's it from me, short and sweet. I wanted to tell you a little bit about how we think about net zero, what that means in terms of our thinking about the energy transition, how we are approaching this issue of the just transition, and particularly managing the employment as we transition to net zero. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to the engagement.
Thank you very much. Really interesting. We've had a couple of questions from the audience. I'm going to dive straight in with the one that's been upvoted the most, not surprisingly, about load shedding. So it said, with the increase in load shedding, how do we build a groundswell of support for renewable energy to deliver national energy security that forces the government to act? So a little bit about how do you build support, and also how do you influence the government there?
Yeah, I mean, so, obviously we are facing an immediate crisis in terms of load shedding, and load shedding is having a very serious deleterious impact on people and their livelihoods, on kids wanting to study for school, and very importantly on the economy. So it's putting a whole lot of our manufacturing processes and small businesses at risk. So it's very much top of mind. Load shedding is principally due to the failure of government. This goes back, over many decades, to timeously procure new generation capacity. It also goes to the existing coal fleet, a large proportion of which is beyond its economic life, and which has been under-maintained over a prolonged period. And there's some element of mismanagement linked to those power stations. There's also been a very deleterious period of state capture, which has led to a criminalization of the value chains around these coal-fired power stations. So there's substandard coal being delivered. There's a whole range of incidents of theft, and there's some outright sabotage at our power stations. So dealing with load shedding means, first of all, getting on top of the existing coal fleet and managing them properly, putting proper security in place, and getting on top of these highly organized criminal networks. And then, working with the various authorities to upgrade the grid, put renewables on, get batteries procured, maximize our pump storage capacity, and put some peaking capacity in place. There's, all of that, the load shedding is acting as a major spur to the investment in new generation capacity. So, we're seeing from a renewable energy generation point of view, a huge uptick in investment in the economy. So, everyone is moving, everyone that can, has already put in place their own renewable generation and storage facilities. And it used to be that we relied on the government-driven procurement process through the REI4P to drive that renewable investment. Now, households and the private sector have basically taken over and are pulling on that front. So there's an odd benefit in terms of the climate transition from the current round of load shedding. There is, of course, also a very dysfunctional reaction. So there's a lot of misinformation being put out there. I mean, people are blaming the load shedding on a far too ambitious climate agenda. In fact, not a single power station has been decommissioned because of the climate agenda. The power stations that have been pulled off because they're beyond their economic life, and it's no longer feasible to run them economically. So you're seeing a similar set of battles going on in Europe. There's people are saying that Europe's basically torn up their commitment to the energy transition and they're reverting to old fossil fuels. But in fact, what's not being spoken about in Europe is the way that the response to the war and the energy crisis that they're facing is again laying the foundations for this long-term serious shift onto lower carbon generation.
Thank you. I mean, we don't have much longer, but I know there's a lot of questions from the audience. So I suppose if I could wrap up, one of the questions I'd have for you is for people in South Africa and businesses, what programs can they get involved in order to benefit? I mean, you talked early on in your presentation about export and the danger to exports if you're not, if you don't accelerate this route to net zero. Are there programs and incentives and things that people can register for if they're running a farm or any other kind of business in South Africa that means they're part of the movement, they're sort of going to benefit in that way?
Well, the primary incentive to make these moves and to do this investment in low carbon energy is cost. And it is now the cheapest form of power that's available. So that's the incentive. What government is bringing into place, I mean, it's been a little bit slow because there's been a lobby about this for years. But we're now introducing a feed-in tariff for businesses that have excess power and can sell it onto the grid. And we're introducing at a municipal level net metering. So households that have solar PV and spare battery capacity can again sell power back onto the grid. And that will change the economy. I mean, people are already investing in these technologies because it's least cost and it gives you energy security. But that additional revenue stream is going to then substantially improve the economics of these investments.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your presentation. We look forward to seeing how things develop. That's all we've got time for in this session. So Dr. Crispin Olver, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Our next session is going to build on this theme of integrating just transition to net zero. We'll be back very shortly. You should see a button on your screen saying join the next section, or in fact, I think it says up next. So if you click on that, we'll see you there. Welcome back now for our first panel session of the day. This is Integrating Just Transition to Net Zero. And here to moderate the panel is Rudolf du Plessis, who is the Green Finance Manager for Carbon Trust in South Africa. Rudolf, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Ralph. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our panel discussion on integrating the concepts of a just transition and net zero on the African continent today. Thank you very much for joining us. I'll now have the pleasure to introduce our panelists, and thereafter we'll handle a number of questions for your interest. So first up, we have Anneke Lund. Anneke she's an executive for sustainable finance at Standard Bank. Anneke has led several instrumental sustainable finance deals across sub-Saharan Africa, which has positively contributed towards the development of the sustainable finance market. In her role, she is responsible for driving the right behavior across both client portfolios and within the teams at Standard Bank as it relates to environmental and social impact and mobilizing sustainable finance in the process of doing so. She has been intricately involved in sustainable finance developments for Standard Bank and Standard Bank clients, as well as forming an integral part for the piloting and testing team for South Africa's Green Finance Taxonomy, which was launched late last year. Second, we have Emily Amin, who's the Managing Director and Head of Climate Change at BII, formerly CDC. Emma is a passionate advocate for sustainable development, and in 2019, she was recognized by Apolitico as one of the top 100 influencers on climate policy globally. Emily's career over the past 20 years spans the UK government, multilateral development banks, think tanks, impact investing contexts. Her professional achievements have been underpinned by a doctorate on policy and finance for commercialization of renewable energy in developing economies. As a managing director of BII, she leads teams on climate finance, gender and diversity, investing, and technical assistance. Amongst other roles, Emily is also a senior advisor to the UK COP26 presidency and a member of the independent high-level expert group on climate finance and the OECD advisory group on climate and economic resilience, and has recently become a trustee of the Born Free Foundation. Quite an impressive resume. Next up, we have Nicole Martins, who's the head of stewardship at the Old Mutual Investment Group. Nicole Martins joined the Old Mutual Investment Group Responsible Investment team in May 2022. She's responsible for further building Old Mutual Investment Group's renewable RI initiatives, leading to its proactive stewardship strategy and further developing Old Mutual Investment Group's listed stewardship service capability. Nicole's passion for sustainable development and developing pragmatic and impactful strategies for Africa's just transition to a low-carbon economy in response to the climate emergency is critical to Old Mutual Investment Group's strategy and contribution to the global SDGs. Nicole sits on several working groups and committees such as the Lewis Foundation Climate Risks Analytics for Sustainable Investment Advisory Committee, quite a mouthful, and South Africa UK Partnering for Accelerated Climate Transitions, also known as the UK PAC Programme Advisory Group, and the Transparency Task Force. And then last but not least, we have Vicky Sins, who is the Decarbonization and Energy Transition Lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. So Vicky is responsible for leading the decarbonization of the economy and energy transition, including a just transition for the World Benchmarking Alliance based in Amsterdam. She believes in private sector contribution, responsibility, and accountability by demonstrating how companies in high carbon emitting industries are contributing to reaching the goals of the Paris Agreement and SDG 13. Vicky joined the World Benchmarking Alliance in 2019 after spending the past 14 and a half years working for ABN AMRO Bank and the last 7 years with ABN AMRO Clearing Bank in charge of energy and commodity clients. She has a master's degree in financial management and is an alumni to the Prince of Wales Cambridge Institute for Sustainable Leadership. In addition to her role at WBA, she also sits on the advisory board of EverImpact, a platform to measure CO2 emissions. Vicky also serves on the global task force for the Institute of Managed Accountants, advising on sustainability-related challenges. So, as you can see, we have a very knowledgeable panel ahead of us today, and we thought we were not going to make it easy for them. We're going to ask some tough questions. And to maybe start off with, I'll pose a question to the panel, and I think I'll take the panelists through their answers one by one. So to start off with, what does the just transition mean in South African context, and how might it translate into corporate level policy and practice? Quite a tough question. And Nicole, I'm going to throw you in first.
Great. Thank you, Rudolf. And thanks again to Carbon Trust for the invitation to be part of this panel. And what an impressive panel. So I'm really honored to be part of this discussion with you. when we think about the just transition as Old Mutual Investment Group and what does this mean in the South African context, it's really all about the keyword is really on that transition component. I think there's been a lot of discussion around where we need to get to. We know what the end goal is, and we know by when we ideally need to get there. Now it's about really working with South Africa Inc. to get there in an appropriately ambitious but pragmatic way, right? So for us, when we think about what does the transition mean for South Africa, it's really about taking appropriately nuanced steps forward. And of course, from my perspective and the role that I occupy, it's really about stewarding those companies. We're moving into a new normal. It's something we've not done before. It's a big shift. It's a big change from what we're used to. And so really for me, it's all about staying invested in these companies and helping them through this. So really thinking about what kinds of companies are going to be able to not only take advantage of the shift, but you're going to make it through in a responsible way. And those that are not going to make it, how do we responsibly take them on that journey, right? To sort of, there are going to be sort of industries, ways of doing business that are not going to make it into this new normal. So for me, when we think about what does the transition mean for South Africa, it's really about balancing all of that. But at the end of the day, it's a big opportunity as well, I would say, when we think what does the transition mean for South Africa. And the overarching theme for me is just opportunity to really sort of change our stars if we manage this correctly.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Annika, can I put you in the hot seat next?
Thanks, Rudolph. I think in the South African context, we're obviously talking about transitioning from a very strong reliance on fossil fuels to greener forms of energy. And in so doing, focusing on ensuring the transition is just and equitable, which is a whole lot to get right in one go. I think that it's important when we look at transition policies, when we look at transition strategies, that we ensure that we're considering everybody, not regardless of socioeconomic backgrounds, we're considering everyone involved, everyone needs to benefit from the transition. And I think this can be achieved through creating job opportunities in the green economy, which we've spoken about a lot, which is a theme that comes out a lot in the transition financing world, and protecting the income and jobs of those who are currently working in these hard to abate sectors. At a corporate level, I think we should be looking at our own just transition policies. I know there aren't many available in the market. I mean, as a bank, we're continuously looking out for the developments in the market around just transition. So we don't have a lot of precedents to go to see what this looks like and how it works. But at Standard Bank, we are committed to the Paris Agreement in transitioning Africa to a low carbon economy. And we have released a climate policy in March last year, which says that we would look at developing a transition finance product framework, and we've committed to supporting the just transition through sustainable finance opportunities. So, I think it's obviously something which sits at a national level, but can also be filtered down to corporate or company level in ensuring that we're all working towards a just transition at the end of the day.
Thank you, Annika. Yes, indeed, nuance, very important, and contextualizing is also quite important, I think, especially when we think about the social challenges we face in South Africa. Amalie, just to maybe restate the question. So what does the just transition mean in the South African context, and how might it translate into corporate level policy and practice? We'd be very keen to hear your views. I think you might be on mute, Amalie.
Sorry, yes. I wasn't sure whether to mute myself or not. Sorry about that. Well, I think first of all, and it's great to be able to join this panel. And I think when we look at the issue of the just transition globally, which has now become a very, very topical subject in all contexts, and in fact, it's quite remarkable to see at COP27 how prominent the focus on just transition has become. But I think it's definitely fair to say that South Africa has really been leading the debate and dialogue, particularly at the national level, around the just transition. and I think has a lot of lessons to share and for others to learn from. We ourselves at BII, I mean, we've been working with TIPS, the Trade and Industrial Policy Strategy think tank, around just transition finance roadmaps for South Africa, but also what this means for other economies, including India. Actually, we're looking at how India can learn more from South Africa's experience in that respect. And when looking at the agenda, I mean, it's quite remarkable, the level of, very senior level of political attention from the president, and in fact the president's committee on climate change committee that has really placed huge emphasis on this. And I presume that Crispin Olva has set out that very clearly, that agenda. And the PCC, really provides a very valuable top-down steer. But I think perhaps more importantly is the very strong community engagement that has been underway in South Africa. I myself participated in one of the meetings of the PCC, maybe just almost a year ago now, where the just transition was being discussed, and it was fantastic to see all the communities, particularly coming from the Mpumalanga region, talking about the challenges, but also importantly starting to debate and understand what the opportunities are. And I think from a finance perspective, so we're a development finance institution, and we look to invest in private sector opportunities and alongside the private sector in South Africa. And for us, it's how do we, what are the opportunities that we can then finance? And of course, as many will be aware, that a lot of that has been driven by policy and regulation to a certain extent in South Africa. I think other countries are starting to follow on that front. But I think also very importantly, the role of the financial sector in placing the just transition core to our businesses and our strategies, I think is going to be increasingly important. And so I do think South Africa has a lot to share, and in terms of leading the challenge around the just transition, both domestically, regionally across the continent, as well as globally. It's going to be really a very important journey for us all to engage with and learn from.
Thank you very much. And I think, we always talk about the role of government, we talk about the role of the private sector, but seldomly we talk about the role of communities. And I think that's something critical that we need to reflect on much, much more. Thank you, Emil. Vicky, last up. So what does the just transition mean in the South African context, and how can corporates respond to this? And I think this is something that you're very well placed to speak to.
Now, after the first three speakers, they are very experienced in the South African context, and me talking from a more global perspective, giving also an insight in what actually does it look like. And we started as we're a global NGO looking into what corporate sector accountability actually means when we talk about reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. And then we started to develop this just transition methodology and really laying out what are expectations of the private sector, of companies, when we actually are talking about the just transition. We did this in 2021. We launched this at COP back then, and it was still, like also Dr. Amalie said, really a relatively new concept. Companies still trying to understand and get their heads together around what is a transition, what does a decarbonization look like, and then adding the social components on this. Since then, we've measured 270 companies across 4 high-emitting sectors, also including some South African companies in the oil and gas sector, electric utility sector, transport sector, and really looking into where are they on this journey. And we see that there is still a big disconnect in companies setting out their decarbonization strategies and then their action to actually identify and prepare and then also mitigate the social impacts of such strategies. I hear, the involvement of communities, the involvement of workers. We believe it starts with laying out a true just transition plan, and that's in whichever region you are, and the execution and the implications of such plan are different, but it starts with several steps in a just transition, planning for a just transition. And this can only be informed by really a negotiation through a strong social dialogue, a strong stakeholder engagement, and then also social impact mitigation. So what do we mean with that? We strongly believe that you need to, as I said, include the potential workers and communities that are impacted by the steps that you have laid out in your decarbonization strategy, and then set related time-bound targets for the affected workers and affected people, but also your affected relations, right? It is along the value chain. So it is not as easy as just looking at your own business. You need to also have an integrated plan for your affected business relations. And then, of course, it's about the skills gap and looking into reskilling and upskilling workers, because, of course, new jobs are not necessarily the jobs that are currently there. How are you identifying them, and then lay out a plan to really look at developing the skills that the workers need for the jobs for the future. And then I think a real important element is the advocacy for the right policy that is needed, right? So companies can be a very strong advocacy for what they actually need in order to create all of these environment that they need to successfully execute this. But currently we see that they're still holding back on advocating for the right policies to be in place. And this is not what we say, it's not only the responsibility for the private sector to do this, but it starts with the transparency of the private sector to lay out what are the impacts of their decarbonization plans, because only then you can be transparent about what are the actions needed on the social implications of such decarbonization plans.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And I think what's also quite interesting that you mentioned is that we set these plans often well in advance, and we sometimes struggle to stick to them. But I think we often forget that big master plans are usually iterative, right? So we constantly need to ratchet up our ambition as time goes along, and not simply stick to one plan that was made a decade ago. So no, thank you. That's a very valuable contribution. Next question is, so we've spoken now about the broader South African context, but from your experience, what are the learnings from project level interventions, and how can corporate net zero strategies do more to meet just transition objectives? And very interesting to hear just from your perspectives what individual projects you've learned from, and what are the some of the recommendations and learnings you can share with us from that. Thanks. And maybe I'll just start off again with Nicole. Would you mind sharing some of your experiences thus far?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I mean, it's difficult to think of anything to add after Vicky's great summation of sort of like the main issues. But I do think, from our perspective, because we're listed equity focused, so we're focused on those companies that are listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. And when we look at those companies that are now needing to transition and do so in a sort of socially just way, I think there's a couple of things that stand out as lessons that I think are valuable across industries and across company size. And the first one of those is really about taking, to Vicky's point, around a holistic approach to these things. I think it's really important to emphasize the fact that when we talk about environmental, social, and governance issues, those classifications are largely artificial, those sort of silos, and that there is no such thing as a purely environmental, purely social, purely governance issue. They are all infinitely complex and interconnected. So when we talk about the energy transition, for example, this transition to net zero, to which we've also committed as an organization, while the end goal, that specific target, that metric is provided by an environmental issue strictly, you cannot begin to address it at all costs. You sort of need to start thinking about how are you impacting and being impacted by broader factors. That's one big lesson, I think, for all those companies in their transition plans, because if you aren't thinking about that in that holistic, integrated way, you can't even start, right? So you need to be thinking about it as a holistic business strategy issue. And I think to that point, another thing that has been a learning for us is that obviously this transition, it's in the name, right? It's a journey, and that different companies will be at different levels or different positions in this journey. But really, the way that we could see it is borrowing heavily from something like the Climate Action 100+ framework, is that the first step is really about acknowledging that there is a problem and that you as a corporate, as a project, have some role to play in addressing that. That's really the first step. Once you've got that on board, it's really looking at, all right, well, what is the commitment we make, right? So what is within our circle of influence? What is a appropriately ambitious but realistic commitment for us to make, a target for us to set? And then again, to some of the points that have been raised previously around that social conditions, it's around when I'm developing as a company, as a corporate, my plan for addressing this, so for achieving that target or meeting that commitment, have I done so in an inclusive way and sort of co-created that with my material stakeholders? Because just like your point, Rudolf, around it's difficult to try and implement a plan that was set 10 years ago without acknowledging that things might shift, it's equally difficult to implement a plan that requires participation from parties that were not consulted when you put the plan together. So I think that's a really big lesson and something that's often overlooked when you look at these strategies. And then, I mean, once you're at the point where you've got that plan and you're implementing, it's really just about communicating your progress as you go, making sure that you are agile and able to adjust. I mean, we know that this field is rapidly evolving. The data, the tools, the platforms, the initiatives, the acronyms, there's new ones every day. And you need to be able to think on your feet and to take that into consideration and to adjust appropriately from all angles. So whether you're a company that's trying to do that, a project that's seeking finance, someone who's trying to finance these things, you really can't be dogmatic in the way you want to approach the issue. So I think those would be some of the sort of key learnings we've got, at least from the dealings that we've had on this and trying to help some of the bigger companies and smaller ones, but the ones that are listed at least, and trying to meet the expectations of a number of different stakeholders.
No, fantastic. Thanks, Nicole. And you tie in really well to Vicky's point on transparency. If we have these plans in place, we end up implementing projects, we don't communicate our results, it's almost impossible for us to then ratchet up that plan later on to improve it, to fine tune it as we go along. And I think that's something that needs to be stressed. We can make firm commitments and communicate our results every now and then, but if we aren't absolutely transparent in those, we are at risk of potentially losing a lot of gains that could have been made. Annika, do you have any specific project level learnings that you can share with us today?
I think there are some valuable lessons that can be taken out of project level interventions. We've referred to this quite a bit already, but engaging local communities is really key in ensuring an equitable transition. That's really very clear. So I think a lot of the learnings really come back to that level of engagement. So firstly, I think training and job opportunities, I think I've mentioned that before. Secondly, I think it's important to assess the impact on communities and to ensure that it's addressed through the mitigation measures that are being pursued. I think corporate net zero strategies could be designed to ensure that the benefits of the transition are shared amongst all shareholders, including the local communities, not only those that are directly involved in these projects. And I think lastly is around incentives. For corporate net zero strategies to provide incentives for the adoption of renewable energy sources and the development of green infrastructure. I think that can really drive the uptake of these strategies. So really kind of themed around community impact, training, job opportunities, and incentives. Some of the key valuable lessons that have come out of those interventions.
Thank you very much. I think that's leads us into our next speaker, Amal. Do you have any project level interventions that you can share with us today? And I think it's quite refreshing to hear those in the financial sector also speaking about the social interventions and how that can be integrated into our environmental work. And I think it's critical for where we are at this stage of our development in South Africa. So keen to hear what views you may be able to share.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously, as a development finance institution, we have always placed a lot of emphasis on the sort of social development dimension of all our investing. But we actually set, when we developed our climate strategy back in 2020, which we launched in 2020, we actually placed just transition as one of our core 3 pillars. So we have a pillar on net zero, a pillar on adaptation and resilience, and then a sort of cross-cutting, but the third pillar is also around just transition. And the reason we did this is because we always look at the number of jobs that we create through our investments as one indication of a positive development impact. So it seemed to us to make sense to prioritize the focus on just transition. And as we've looked to implement that, we've taken, I suppose initially the focus was more around the transition to the net zero climate resilient development pathways. So looking at those opportunities, looking at how we're investing in, for example, a renewable energy equity platform in India, where we provided also a lot of training, upskilling for women in particular to be able to get relatively sort of senior technical jobs within that renewables industry, utility scale renewables. So this was the initial focus, this sort of focus on the transition in, but of course the transition out is where some of the risks need to be more effectively addressed. And we started to innovate a bit there, and I just wanted to fully agree with the points that were made earlier, in particular, I think Nicole's point that we really need to integrate just transition into our broader frameworks, and ESG in particular. It shouldn't be seen as an add-on. It needs to be fully mainstreamed and integrated, whilst recognizing there may need to be a particular set of areas of focus and bringing out the importance of just transition when taking projects to investment committees. But one area that we started to look at was looking at some investments in the fossil fuel sector. I think there was one particular project we were looking at, that heavy fuel oil, that we were looking to exit from that because we were looking to exit in any case, and we were starting to identify what could we do as part of our exit strategy to encourage that company to actually work with local communities and ensure workers had a good sort of process for managing any loss of jobs related to the closure of that plant. Now this, I think, is is quite challenging. It's new. It's something I think we still have some way to go, but seems to be very much the direction of travel. That as how do we integrate this into what we're already doing on the ESG context.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Vicky, finally, can we reflect on some of your project level experiences? I know WBA has done fantastic work in terms of establishing metrics and measures for transition, and we'd be very keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. And it is very interesting to hear others reflect on this as well, because I think what I want to highlight for this specific point is that we're not just looking for a reference on just transition itself, right? We want to really make sure that the content of the plan and the content of the execution is resulting in a just and equitable transition. And often that's why we need to look at a very detailed level of what actually is being addressed in a project or in a specific region or by a specific sector or company. And I think in this instance, it has to also start with a basic level of, it was already referenced, the ESG, but the social elements have to be right. And I think that is where we've also seen that there is still a big gap, because there are minimum level criteria that have already been set out by the UN guiding principles on providing decent work, human rights. And there we still see, although these guiding principles have been in place for a decade, there is still a big gap in addressing those. And I think on top of that, we're looking into just an equitable transition, but we also do not need to forget that those basic principles need to be in place. And what we've seen that in level of instances when addressing a just transition, we're also looking at green and decent creation, right? We want to, that is part of and transitioning into the new future. But there is this that a lot of the new jobs that are being created are not necessarily good jobs. And I think that is something that needs to be kept right front and center in I've heard Dr. Amalie saying in transitioning out, to say where we're transitioning into, that needs to also follow these basic principles of being and providing decent work for the workers and the community. I think one last thing I want to say is what we really see as a positive is that there is more and more cross-sectoral collaboration, right? We see that there is this need to look beyond your own sector for these new jobs, where we see cooperation between the traditional fossil fuel companies with the renewable energy companies, with some of the mining industry companies with providing renewable energy. And I think that is where what the next level of projects and really addressing sort of these a lot of these just transition elements in, is that when you plan for your decarbonization strategies, the element about, you know, the new jobs and reskilling of upskilling of workers, there needs to be also cooperation outside of your own company, because not all company or not all displaced workers potentially can be found a new job in your own organization. Hence, there is the need to look beyond different sectors.
And that touches on a very critical point that we're facing in South Africa at the moment, where we see a massive diversification in future of our energy system. And we cannot expect one single utility to provide the employment in future. I guess another question that also, another point that you raised that also resonated with me was, do we create jobs for the sake of creating jobs, or are those jobs sustainable and long lasting? And I think if you really truly plan to address social issues in a country like South Africa or on the African continent more broadly, we need to look at decent jobs and not just jobs. So, final question, just to maybe start with you, Nicole. So, going beyond national policy, what can be done to encourage and enable corporates to pursue ambitious and just net zero strategies? And what challenges do corporates face? It'd be very interesting to hear what experiences corporates have had, and what are the things that corporates that wish to embark on a sustainability journey need to look out for in terms of the challenges and pitfalls that lie on the road?
Yeah, thanks, Rudolf. I do think that we've touched on a couple of these already. I mean, there's going to be the usual suspects that will come up, or, you know, there'll be this whole the idea of data and technologies that you need, and how do you prioritize or balance between sort of the environmental and the social targets, like that kind of thing. And we've touched on the need for engagement, which I think is really important. So the challenges component I might park for now, because I think we have addressed a lot of that. But I think when it comes to what do the corporates of South Africa need to be thinking about in developing their transition strategies, and I do think it's a core component now of your business strategy. It's really, I mean, from the perspective of a long-term investor, we are very carefully examining where we're putting money right now, because we are, as I say, long-term institutional investors. Our timeline is, you know, it's not 3 or 5 years, it's 10, 20, 30 years. We're looking at, do you have a plan to still be a going concern at that time, right? So as a corporate, it's not a nice to have, it's not something that you can leave for the next CEO or farm out to a consultant. You really need to take this on board. It's a core to your business strategy. But one of the things that I would encourage corporates to do in developing this strategy is to focus on real world impact, right? One of the things that's very easy to do when we talk about transitioning to net zero, for example, it's very easy to do that on paper. So from an investment perspective, if we want to get our portfolio to net zero, there's very quick and easy ways to do that on paper, and that's to sort of kick out any of the high emitters, or to just heavily invest in offsets. And on paper, we've achieved our target and that looks great for us, but we've changed nothing in the real world, right? We've not made any of that difference, like you were saying, about maybe we've created jobs, maybe we've decreased emissions, but it's on a spreadsheet, it's not in the real world. So we haven't actually addressed the problem. So for me, I think as a corporate that's hoping to navigate the space and develop a strategy that makes sense and that is actually viable and resilient, you need to be thinking about what is the real world impact of this strategy. So what is the impact that these decisions that I make have beyond, and how am I going to be impacted in real terms by what's happening around me? So I think if you're focusing on it like that, instead of looking at it as an obligation or a compliance burden, some sort of grudge purchase, really think about how are the decisions that we're making, how is the strategy that I'm developing affecting the sustainability, the stability, and the resilience, not only of my company, but of the market in which I'm expected to operate. I think you'll already be starting to think about this in a much more realistic and a much more impactful way. And doing so might fly counter to what some of your stakeholders might want. You know, if they're asking you for sort of quick turnaround, they want you to just copy paste a framework, or you know, quickly agree to some sort of target in your integrated annual reports. And it's very tempting to rainbow wash or green wash and sort of say, oh no, of course we'll get to that, of course we'll do that because everyone else is saying they'll do it. I think focus on what is the real world impact of what I'm doing, and that way you build a strategy that is really robust.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nicole. I mean, that's a critical question, and that's also something that we always try and raise awareness of, that climate change is around the corner, and if we keep thinking in silos, we purely focus on our own sector, there might not be that much to do if we're too late. So no, thank you very much for that. Annika, do you have any specific views that you could share with us? So what challenges do corporates face when it comes to going on this journey?
Yeah, I think challenges, Nicole's referred to the usual suspects. I think those are still the key challenges. So lack of access to data and information on your carbon footprint. As a bank, something which we're also busy dealing with and looking at. You know, it's very hard to put targets in place for your scope 3 emissions when you don't know what your current position is. I think there's a lack of public-private partnership. So if we look at the benefits that we can gain from public-private partnerships in the form of blended finance, if you look at examples such as the Debt for Nature swaps in Belize last year, where government insured the bond that was raised, and you know, the important role that the government played in advancing the funding through the debt capital markets. You know, that more of that needs to be done, I think, and more of those types of partnerships can really unlock and progress the sustainable finance market. But also, when you look at public-private partnerships, we're talking about environmental strategy and project development. So, you know, municipalities working with communities to develop energy efficiency projects, and there are some examples of this in Africa, where communities have really invested and bought into the idea of energy efficiency with the help of the municipalities and some funding, and they really feel like they own it, and it works because they understand it, and it's something which they've also contributed towards building out. I think, you know, yes, the cost of renewable energy has reduced significantly, and Dr. Oliver referred to the fact that that's the cheapest form of energy at the moment. But I think it is still seen as a high cost or a high cost to transition to greener technologies. Obviously, there's a high cost initially or upfront, but over the long term, it will yield a lot more benefits. I think it's getting over that thinking of the high cost barrier. And then I think lastly, you know, probably around what is it is fairly clear to see what's going to happen up until, let's say, 2030. Beyond that, to 2050, what are the green technologies that we're going to be looking at, and what will be the availability of those green technologies? So that those are some of the I think kind of challenges we're facing and discussing when we're looking at this transition.
Yeah, no, thanks, Annika. You provided us with some challenges, but also some solutions. So public-private partnerships and innovative financing is what will enable us to undertake this transition, and also potentially prepare us for what technologies might be around the corner. That was very valuable. Thank you. Emily, from your perspective as a DFI, how do you perceive the challenges faced by corporates, and what can corporates do?
Yeah, so I think everything that's just been said, I fully agree with, because, you know, as we're looking at how investors, you know, long-term investors, are starting to set their own transition plans to net zero, it's becoming increasingly clear that corporates will need to be able to provide the necessary data and reporting to demonstrate that they are able to fit within these portfolios that are increasingly aligning to net zero. And so, of course, then, the just transition dimension, whilst it's not yet fully recognized as core to ESG, but certainly it seems to be the direction of travel. And I think in South Africa, in addition to government leadership, I mean, the role of the financial sector, the stock exchange in integrating just transition into reporting, of course, initiatives like the World Benchmarking Alliance also being very valuable in that context. So, I mean, all of this additional scrutiny and transparency, I think it's becoming increasingly clear that corporates will need to place just transition as, pretty much part of their core to their strategies to really raise the capital that will be needed. But I think what more could be done, I think it'd be great to see some corporate just transition bonds start to be put out, to really sort of demonstrate to the market what exactly this means. And, I think for corporates that are very energy intensive, that may be very reliant on fossil fuels, but where we know there is potential to transition, and I think particularly some of the, the big industrial sectors, I think could be really, really interesting ways of raising capital to actually enable the just transition from, high carbon to low or net zero consistent carbon business models and value chains as well. So I'm thinking, whether steel industry, cement sector, the opportunity, we know the technologies are emerging. There will be higher cost of those technologies in many respects, but there may well also be some opportunities for sustainability or sustainability linked pricing, which can bring in the just transition dimension within that context. I'm a big fan, as I think you read my bio, of sustainable development. And sustainable development is social, economic, and environmental coming together. And I think that's where we need to be using financial instruments to help further attract and catalyze and move sectors and corporates along, on their journeys.
No, thank you, Emily. That's very valuable. I mean, we often have the question of transition bonds and what that might look like, and it's encouraging to see that some South African corporates, thinking of Anglo specifically, who have raised the social bond from IFC to help with their just transition related initiatives is really an encouraging step. So I think for the African continent, marrying international best practice with contextual needs is really what's critical. And I think DFIs such as yourself play a critical role in disseminating those experiences. Vicky, last one on the panel, but not least. So from your perspective, working very closely with corporates, what are the challenges they face, and what encouraging signs have you seen in overcoming that?
Yeah, I think just as a basic principle, and what corporates would like to see, of course, is an enabling policy and finance environment in the end, right? Whatever they do, they want to feel supported that policy and regulation will follow and that finance will flow to support the plans that they have. And I think a lot has been said about data availability already. I think the big challenge is indeed this need to increase data transparency, right? We will see that there will be more regulation coming. And I think the first step will be on really doubling down on credible transition plans. And that starts with really integrating time-bound, long-term, medium, short-term transition plans. And I think that needs to be backed up by financial scenario planning. All the tools are there. You can do that sectoral, you can do that regional. So there is no, from our perspective, no excuse to not be transparent and really do the scenario planning for your respective sector and region, because that will then allow to really let investments flow and support financials solutions, whether that's public-private partnership, whether that is through whatever bonds or other solutions that we have. But it can only happen if that transparency is there on what is needed in order to support that real economy change. And I think one of the clear message that we want to send as well through our alliance is that, and what we've aimed to do yesterday, we have an investor statement out signed by 54 large financial institutions, giving a clear signal, for example, to the oil and gas industry, saying you need to start doubling down on your decarbonization efforts, and that needs to go hand in hand with the Just Transition Plan. Having that statement out there really signals not only to the listed equity and listed companies, but gives a wide international financial signal to all companies, whether it's state-owned, private-owned, they're all reliant in the end on also international financial markets, that this is a very high priority for letting investments and finance flow. And I think that is just one example to really show that companies can go more transparent. That's how we can highlight leadership. We can share learnings in regions, in across sectors, but also in the end hold private sector to account if there is a lack of really helping to support the deliverables of the SDGs.
Thank you very much, Vicky. I think what we need to really keep in mind over the next few years, which are critical, is that we don't just need sectoral change, we need systemic change. And I think having a set level of metrics that we can use to actually assess the performance of our industries across continents, across economies, is what we will need. And I think the WBA plays a very encouraging role in that regard. So thank you very much. Colleagues, we don't have much time left for Q&A. We were planning on taking some questions from the panel, but the discussions ended up being so fruitful and interesting that we ran a bit over time. But I want to thank all of you very much for your participation and for sharing your very insightful views. And we hope to see you on various platforms again, having similar conversations as they evolve. And we'd like to just close off by saying thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, Rudolf. Thank you, everybody on the panel. Some great insights from all of the speakers. If you'd like more insights, please head to carbontrust.com. Under the news and events section, you'll be able to sign up for our newsletter, which gives you all of the latest news in, I think, an easily digestible format. Now, next, we're going to talk about implementing and financing your corporate transition to net zero. And we're going to hear from leading companies, including De Beers, Nedbank, IFC and Vodacom. So please click on the Up Next button, which is on your screen, and we will see you shortly. Welcome back. This panel is titled Implementing and Financing Corporate Transition. Here to tell us more and to introduce the panel is the Carbon Trust's Renata Lawton-Misra, who is a Senior Sustainability Manager based in Johannesburg. Renata, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Ralph, and welcome and thanks to everyone joining our event. I'm Renata and I'm part of our Africa team, although I'm sitting in a very chilly London office today, but I'm delighted to be moderating our second and final panel discussion for today. For those of you who may have joined our previous Route to Net Zero event series at the end of 2021, You may recall that our panel discussion had touched on some of the nuances of net zero and where to begin, particularly how achieving this bold target will require systemic shifts within the next decade if we are to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. So, building on those conversations from last year, we've had some really interesting addresses for the first part of our event on integrating just transition into net zero strategies. And again, the systemic shifts that are required to enable a just net zero transition. And over the course of the next 45 minutes, we've planned to hear from both corporates and financiers on their experience with implementing and financing corporate low carbon transition commitments, particularly in emerging markets. So the term net zero has been at the forefront of everyone's attention over the last couple of years, with countries, cities, and organizations declaring net zero targets by 2050. However, while setting decarbonization goals is somewhat straightforward, the means to achieve them can be less clear. And this gap between targets and implementation and action threatens a climate-safe future. So, in order for companies to bridge this gap, we will need to break free from business as usual thinking in support of holistic business model transformations that also considers ecosystems and building partnerships with value chain and other actors to overcome reticence and obstacles and harness opportunities for the transition to net zero emissions. So, once these targets have been set, decarbonization strategies are established, and roadmaps and capital planning are complete, management action is needed to start implementing decarbonization plans. This decarbonization action is often in the context of organizational growth objectives in emerging markets with significant local decarbonization challenges, as well as potential challenges in accessing the required finance to make this transition happen. So, this panel discussion will aim to share the perspectives of corporates and financiers and showcase some real life examples centered around practical actions and learnings in the actual process to decarbonize own operations and value chains, and what it takes to leapfrog to clean business growth. I'm joined by illustrious panelists today who are going to share some of their perspectives, potential challenges faced, and insights on either implementing their net zero plans or on the financing of these corporate transitions, particularly within emerging markets. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to very briefly introduce themselves, their organization, and their role. And so I'll start with Nola, followed by Arvana, Kirsten, and then Christelle. Nola, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Renata. So Nola Richards, I work for the Vodacom Group. I head up the ESG and sustainable business function, who owns what we call our planet strategy, which includes our net zero targets, and work very closely with the experts across the business, including key partners like procurement and our head of energy, of whom none of it would be possible if we don't have them on our side.
Great, so glad to have you with us, Nola. Arvana.
I'm Arvana Singh, and I head up Sustainable Finance Solutions within Nedbank Corporate and Investment Bank. And effectively, we're responsible for developing and structuring sustainability-linked financing products, as well as green loans, green bonds, etc.
Super, welcome, Arvana. Kirsten.
Hi, and thanks for having me here. So, Kirsten Hunt, head of carbon neutrality for De Beers Group, the diamond company, part of Anglo American. De Beers has committed to be carbon neutral for 2030, and well, it's my job to work with every part of the business to make sure we get there in time, basically.
Great, thanks so much for joining us, Kirsten. And lastly, Christelle.
Morning, everybody. Christelle van Vuren here. I am representing the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, and sitting in also a relatively cold Washington, D.C., and dialing in from my capacity as a technical lead in our corporate climate advisory unit, which is situated in our sustainable infrastructure advisory team. I complement a very large and diverse cohort of colleagues who are focused on climate business in particular and greening our infrastructure transactions. We work directly with corporates to really upscale their ambition in this climate space.
Thanks so much, Christelle. As I mentioned, illustrious panelists today. So it's great to have you all here. And just again, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm going to dive right in with our first question, and this will be for our two corporates. So as companies or industries that have emissions-intensive operations and or emissions-intensive value chains, what are some of the challenges you have faced or learnings in trying to transform your operations? And coupled with that, have there been challenges or opportunities with engaging suppliers and customers to transition their own operations and value chains? So I'm going to hand over to Kirsten first, and then to Nola.
Thanks so much. And that is a very big question. And yeah, lots of challenges and learnings. And maybe let me start with the learnings, because I think any of us in this, for any one of us who's in this space, it is a continuous and very steep learning curve, right? Because things change so fast in this field, and I think we all agree this climate change is probably the biggest challenge humanity has faced and is facing. So we need to go fast, and we need to learn and change fast. And for that, I think that's my first learning. It's like for something as transformative as getting a company to net zero, you need everybody on board, right? It's great if a strategy is supported from the top, and if a big, very ambitious corporate target is set, but it needs to be owned by all parts of the organization. Otherwise, you're not going to get there. So it's about implementing the change and doing all that and taking all the technical steps that are needed to bring down your corporate footprint, but it's also about organizational change. This is not something we can do as an afterthought, right? We really need to make sure that low carbon development is an integrated part of every step of the way as we do business. And to make sure everybody within the organization owns it and also really has the tools and the knowledge to walk the talk. Because yes, it is really important as a company, as I said, to reduce our emissions as a mine, but we also want everyone within the organization to have the tools to be able to give the message and also to know how to reduce their own carbon footprint, right? So, and that makes it sometimes a slower process than we wanted, because it's not just about a technical implementation, like, oh, let's just mitigate the impacts. It's really about changing systems and processes and bringing everybody along the way. Also, and secondly, as a learning, climate strategy can't be a standalone piece, right? It's very much connected to the first piece. It needs to be embedded in your sustainability strategy. As De Beers, we have our Building Forever strategy, which is about leaving a lasting positive legacy. And our climate strategy is very much part of that, because we need to make sure that whatever we do on climate is also has a positive impact on biodiversity, does create jobs and skills for the people where it's most needed, does not have a negative water impact, things like that. So we really need to make sure that it is all very much part of a broader sustainability strategy. Otherwise, it won't last and it won't be really sustainable. And the third piece is that, especially for operations like ourselves, which are large mining operations, that you can't get there without an enabling, well, with all your stakeholders on board and including an enabling regulatory framework. So it's really important to not only have that internal dialogue, but also have a dialogue with the rest of your stakeholders. Well, there's a lot more, but I should probably leave it at that for now, and have the others have a say, and I'll get into some of the other challenges and learnings later on in the discussion.
That's great, Kirsten. Thank you so much. And you touched on some really key points there. But I'll hand over to Nola if you've got additional insights to add as well.
Yeah, so thanks, Kirsten, for covering off all the hard and sticky stuff. I think it's most important you have the right skills, the right capacities in place. You know, you can't expect somebody to deliver an energy transition if you don't have energy experts. And you can't expect somebody to consider, for example, do they take into account energy efficiency, environmental impact in the supply chain if it's not actually built into the process. So I think I'm building off what Kirsten said in terms of even, for example, regulatory environment, the organizational change. I think the one thing from a telco perspective is just an appreciation of our infrastructure. I think that's it's very important, and moving from a bank to a telco, I think it became even more stark and challenging for me, where you go from a very limited set of buildings that you need to manage to where you're at a telco where we have across Africa over 24,000 points that are drawing power, and of which many of those drawing relatively small amount of power, which means, you know, you've got to start to look at your, when you're looking at solutions, looking at the cost versus returns and so forth. So I think that first appreciation is just knowing your environment and understanding exactly what those requirements are, and then trying to find very different and innovative ways to find solutions. We've also, working across Africa, we do have some operations where even if you are on a relatively green grid, for example, in the DRC, because of the limited infrastructure of the distribution grid, most of our points of presence are actually off-grid because there is just no connection to get onto that clean power grid. So, and then further, in some instances, we are constrained. A telco tower may be located in a space where you can't actually deploy a solution such as solar panels because there's just physically no space to be able to do that. So taking those things into account and then also looking at the environment in which you operate, I think is very important. For example, in South Africa, with the ongoing infrastructure failures that we have, what we are finding is that if we want to continue to supply the quality of service our customers expect, we're actually landing up going backwards in our net zero strategy, much to our frustration. Everybody's working forward, but because of the infrastructure failures, we're pumping more diesel into the operations, which actually just means we're going in the wrong direction. So I think in terms of that, considering that complexity, what we've had to look at and to do is actually to be quite creative and come up with a blend of solutions. I sometimes envy organizations where you can go and, you know, potentially put up a nice big solar PV farm, or you can go and put in a nice biofuel generation capability. But we do have to look at a variety of solutions. So whether it be renewable energy powered rural grids, rural masts, microgrids, we're looking at things like power purchase agreements, micro turbines. So it's really about having to come up with a blended solution, which has been quite important for us. And then I think also final learning is to say sometimes you need to take a step back, and rather than focusing on, and I think it's a balance, the minutiae, you do sometimes need to look at the big picture. And as an example, you know, for us to transition 15,000 towers in South Africa on an individual basis is going to just, number one, take forever. It's going to cost a fortune. So very innovative thinking brought around a solution which we are working closely with Eskom and government partners and engaging other corporates on, is what we call a virtual wheeling platform, which actually will enable us to put additional renewable power into the South African electricity grid, which will thus benefit ourselves, but the country as a whole. And then I think the best part of it for me is also it's a platform where other corporates can come on board, so that scale and the impact can grow. So I think the lesson is just understand the environment in which you're working, building on what Kirsten said about the organizational change, the people, and taking people along the journey, but also balancing, looking at the very minute detail and then looking at a bigger picture to try and find more holistic solutions.
Thank you, Tola. That was really insightful. And I think, as you mentioned, you know, we have to really be aware of what the realities are of, you know, the challenges and barriers that we face in our market and how that is hindering immediate progress. But again, to what you and Kirsten mentioned, how we ensure that our progress isn't really done or made in isolation, but really that we try to tap into this whole environment and ecosystem around us and really try to enable all of these different players so we can move together and ensure no one's left behind. So thank you so much. Those are really great responses. I think also touching on something that you mentioned, Kirsten, is with transforming operations and engaging with value chains, a lot of this is new, and these are all processes that companies haven't gone through before, and so we're all sort of learning by doing. And so I wondered if you could share some insight and learnings in terms of pursuing technology research development and demonstration, or technology RD&D, to implement the initial pillars of your decarbonization strategy.
Sure, and that is, I mean, our strategy is really is around 3 pillars. Reduce, which is about increasing efficiency to make sure that we use less energy and just emit less, and replacing fossil fuels and fossil-based energy, and lastly, recover or remove, which is about offsetting the last remaining emissions that we cannot fully get rid of. And all of those require a massive amount of R&D and innovation, if you like. And I think the most important and the most challenging one we're very much diving into at the moment is diesel replacement. Like renewable energy, it needs to be done. And I think the fact that it's often hard to explain to when I talk to people in our value chain that are based in Europe and that tell me like, oh, can you please confirm to us that from 2024 onwards, you will only get your power from renewable energy? It's like, well, you can switch providers, but we need to build the stuff from scratch. So it's going to probably take a little longer than 6 months to get there. So that part, but for renewable energy, I mean, we know how to build, and there's companies out there, we know how to build solar and wind energy and to get there. For fuel replacement, it's a lot more challenging at this point in time, right? And in particular, where we are in Southern Africa, there's basically no supply for any kind of alternative fuel. So we're doing a lot of work with Anglo American and with other partners to really look at, again, what potential would there be? I mean, there's obviously electrification. There's all the work that we're doing and that Anglo American has done on green hydrogen trucks. And an enormous amount of R&D has gone into that. Can we deploy that at our mine sites at a much larger scale? And what other alternatives are there? So that's one piece where, yeah, we're really looking at every option out there, and there's so many wild ideas out there as well, right? It's like, what can we do? And we talk to everybody, and what can we realistically bring to scale in time? Another one that I'm quite excited about is an investment we've done in a company called Kelp Blue, which is basically planting and farming giant kelp just off the coast of Namibia, with the idea to eventually make biostimulant out of the kelp, which will have a big impact on agricultural production, but also the kelp has an enormous potential to sequester carbon. So we are working with them, one, to get the company off the ground, because it's in an area where jobs are limited, where they're really developing a very poor town with limited opportunities and bringing in PhD students from all over the country and employing all kind of young people in this new industry. And we're also looking with them, can we develop a methodology to actually measure the amount of carbon that the kelp, the seaweed sequesters? Eventually, we might get carbon credits out of it. We also might not get it, but it's one of those gambles where we say, listen, we need to invest. We do think this industry will add value from a sustainability perspective, no matter what. And we're going to try to see what we can get done there. I just said, when we're doing a lot of other things, we're looking at the potential for kimberlite rock, so the waste rock from our mine sites, if that has a potential to sequester carbon. So there's different bits and pieces. And we are always really trying to combine that kind of research with the whole idea of jobs and skills development. And can we in particular get women and girls more involved, the whole women and girls in STEM piece of it? What kind of local entrepreneurship can we develop? Our operations in Namibia are developing a partnership with one of the Namibian universities to look at, can we do a green energy, can we build a green energy learning hub in Oranjemund, which is a diamond mining town in Namibia, not just for us, but really to see like, okay, we have a testing ground there, we can bring in students from all over the country and we can help them learn, and we can learn something from what they're doing themselves as well. So yeah, it is a really important part. I would like it to go even faster to get us all the solutions we need, but we see it as our R&D and innovation as a crucial part of our carbon neutral strategy.
Thanks, Kirsten, and some really interesting initiatives there for us to understand more about. So Nola, I know that you might have some perspectives, particularly on the fuel switching that Kirsten had mentioned, but again, would also like to get some of your thoughts on and your insights around pursuing some technology RD&D.
Yeah, so I think very similar to the De Beers, we first start with the reduce. So incorporated into our formal supply chain process are discussions with our global supply chain to really drive. We've got a lot of technology radios on all of the masts. You've got the batteries, the gen sets, and so array of equipment that we need to focus on. And the nice thing is, as Scope 3 becomes more important, we are our suppliers, Scope 1 and 2. So listen to me, we become our suppliers, Scope 3. So hopefully that virtuous circle will continue to drive the innovation, because they need to make sure that their emissions are going down, which means they are going to aim to give us more efficient technologies in terms of that. And this cuts across the chain. I mean, we're even engaging with handset suppliers to understand, how do you decrease the energy requirements? When you start to look at handsets in the billions, you can start to look at the scale of energy that is required just for all of the devices that are out there. And then I think looking at that, it's also about how do we look quite innovatively in terms of the recycling and the repurposing of handsets. So not directly in terms of the carbon, our greater net zero goals, but we're working in partnership with the WWF, where we're trying to number one, extend the life of devices, because the longer the device exists, then obviously the overall carbon footprint will decrease. But also, how do we get access to technology into the hands of consumers who may not have? And here, this is quite what we are trying to do as a telco, is blend our green ambitions alongside with development of communities and creating a platform for digital society. So one of the areas which I guess is not as sexy and as innovative as a kelp farm, which I really, really love, but really across the continent, we're looking at working with partners in microgrids. Really, that's such an important solution for us, because not only are we then decreasing our own footprint, but we have the opportunity to connect the community around us. We are able to provide solutions where small businesses and enterprises can actually tap in and use renewable energy for their own purposes as well. While alongside that, we deliver access to telecommunications as well as financial services, because with Vodacom, we actually have financial services solutions as well. So really looking at the solution and the impact to the community more broadly and holistically, to deliver multiple benefits to the organizations, to the communities around us. I think the exciting thing, and I guess it links a little bit to the previous question about the lessons learned, is establishing very focused groups to understand where you really need to dig in deep. Talking about the alternative energies, as we have a group that is digging deep into that and exploring, I think it is important for us to look at each of the proposed technologies and think a little bit about it in terms of the lifespan of the solutions, because I think sometimes it's very tempting to rush in to a solution, but have you actually thought about the potential impact further down the road? So, for example, with hydrotreated vegetable fuels, if everybody on scale had to switch to that, it would be an absolute devastation to food production. So whilst we do need to consider that as a medium-term intervention, we are going into it in a very realistic way, saying that this is not a long-term solution. We do need to say, yes, this is a bit about our transition, but we need to then make sure that we've got more sustainable options going forward. And even when you are looking at those solutions, looking at the credibility of those solutions, understanding the value chain, for example, of the HVOs, to understand where is it produced, and if somebody wants to come and engage with us and understand, the full environmental impact, are we able to justify and really be clear that from literally the production through the process, we have not perpetuated greenwashing, or worse yet, haven't looked at the supply chain and ensured that the proper certifications and controls are in place to be able to substantiate our claims. I think that's something which we're very wary of, is making sure that when we say we're going to do something, that it is something which is not greenwashing, that it delivers a genuine benefit. And then, as I say, the longer term impacts, that we consider those as well.
Thank you so much, Nola. That was really great. And as you mentioned, as much emphasis needs to be placed on those transition solutions as what you would place on sort of your longer term sustainability solutions as well. But I'm going to switch this question around and pose it to our two other panelists. So for financiers, are there any aspects in pursuing technology RD&D that might pose barriers in providing green or transition finance? So Christelle, I'd love to get your and Arvana's thoughts on this, and perhaps starting with you.
Great, thanks Renata. Yes, indeed. So I think you're quite right that some technologies are early stage, and so there is a hesitance around technology risk for investors at large. And different investors will have different roles to play in that maturity journey of that particular technology. And patient capital, such as DFI capital, is particularly important in that, to take those which are in those kind of high technology readiness areas, but not necessarily demonstrated fully, into action. I also think, nonetheless, though, that there is something to be had in a blended finance approach together with that patient capital, and looking at what the coalescing technologies are, if that makes sense. So industry action and momentum behind very particular technological solutions is important. Organizations or clients that are going it alone on very sort of non-standard approaches need to be thought about. We need to understand those technology options so that we keep the playing field open, but momentum behind very particular and effective technological options is going to help us get there a little bit faster than a sporadic or a dispersed approach. So that's when we speak about transport, for instance, and we're talking about very particular technologies and very particular fuels. I think coalition behind those from industry, from financiers, and from others to kind of push those along is really fundamental. And you can see the same thing whether we're speaking about mining or telecoms, that there is crystallization of what those key near-term technologies are that are on the sort of near and mid-term horizon that we can all pile into together to bring into effectiveness.
That's great. Thank you so much, Christelle. Arvana, I'll hand over to you.
Sure, thanks. You know, when you're looking at it from a financing perspective, there's typically two ways in which we finance. So one being on a project finance basis, and the other being on a balance sheet basis where you've got recourse to the corporate. Now, on a project finance basis, it becomes quite important that the technology that underpins that is able to generate, and therefore having a fair degree of confidence and success that the project will generate or the technology will generate is important for a financier, because that ultimately will generate the revenues and the income that will pay back the debt that is taken out. So from that perspective, you know, technologies in terms of being tried and tested, having a degree of confidence around that is quite important. And effectively, you know, being able to ultimately generate from a natural resource perspective becomes quite important to our financing decision. But if we look at how the innovation has moved in the financial markets and bankers becoming more innovative to say, how can we at scale support sustainability, understanding that there are a number of ways that you can get to an ultimate net zero or reduce your scope 1 or scope 2 or scope 3 emissions. And that's where our sustainability linked financing becomes quite relevant, in the sense that we can still fund against the balance sheet of our particular client, but construct those sustainability key performance indicators in a manner that will enable ultimately the blended solution which the corporates are speaking to. So if we look to reduce Scope 1 emissions, there's a number of initiatives underneath that can ultimately result in a reduction in Scope 1. So it does allow a little bit more flexibility. Of course, there's a lot of hard work underneath that needs to happen, but ultimately it enables us to scale sustainable finance by using these type of products into different technologies.
Thank you so much, Arvana. And I think I'm going to dive straight into the next question. And again, Arvana, maybe while you are in the hot seat, in terms of financiers who are financing net zero transitions, what do you need to see from corporates and their planned decarbonization projects to provide that green and transition finance?
Sure. So when we talk about a net zero financing specifically, it is important for us to be able to see a net zero strategy as a start, and effectively, what is that overarching strategy? What is the time frame for that strategy, and what is informing that? And effectively, it's in the context of the country in which the client operates, because we do have different types of net zero trajectories, as well as what is the science-based scenario that the company is adopting. So there are various scenarios, whether that be from the International Energy Agency or different types. So having an understanding of which scenario has been adopted in terms of the net zero strategy and the reasons thereof. But also then attached to that would be effectively the actual initiatives that are being explored in the short, medium, and long term. So it does require robust conversation with the likes of the sustainability teams and our clients to understand the path and trajectory that they're on. And effectively, it's about supporting them from the beginning of the journey with the vision in mind, but also closely aligning that with principles that have emerged in terms of green loan principles and sustainable finance principles, and overlaying that with our own structuring and assessment to ensure that this is additionality, this is a credible strategy, this is not the greenwashing that Nola alluded to earlier. It really is sound, it's credible, it's science-based. There is a path to that, and if not science-based as yet, because we do understand that a lot of borrowers are still adopting that, what is the journey to get there. So ultimately, those are important, but coupled equally with the social and environmental risk assessment that accompanies the various initiatives that are being undertaken, to ensure that there's no significant harm, and effectively that there is some kind of check around what is those social environmental balances. And I think, importantly, we're all aware of the just transition that's evolving and the different frameworks and taxonomies that have come around in that place. So we generally look to the Sustainable Development Goals as a framework in terms of these targets and outcomes still being preserved or move forward. And we also look at other frameworks that are evolving, but careful to ensure that we still remain practical and whilst taking the best elements out of each of those frameworks to get to an ultimate solution.
Thanks so much for sharing all of that. I think that paints a really nice picture, and again, probably one that highlights how complex and integrated this business solution might be. Christelle, what have you seen needed for the provision of financing?
Yeah, super. I mean, I would mimic and echo very strongly everything that Arvana has just mentioned. All of those aspects are absolutely vital. We speak about credibility, robustness, and that transition strategy is the bridge between corporates and financiers. It's the place in which we can deepen the understanding mutually of what's going to take place, and really fundamentally understand what's going to be financed. I think what I want to touch on in complement to that conversation is, we sort of mentioned earlier the greenwashing concern. I think that aspect is starting to emerge in the likes of the role that I've come to fulfill at the IFC, for example, and where financiers are really deepening their own competency to be able to evaluate the credibility and robustness of the plans that are being presented to them and help drive their client base towards higher ambition, greater performance. We see it in the likes of where sustainably linked finance is starting to merge towards the desire for super greens. In other words, really understanding what the performance-based financing is going to be underpinned by in practice, in strategy and implementation planning. And we see it in use of proceeds instruments where we're wanting to understand the credentials and competency of the underlying companies themselves. So there's almost this merging of this question around effective due diligence and effective understanding of whether the companies that are being supported are really prepared and effective in implementing the plans which they present. And I think that takes us back to some of the other aspects that our panelists, Kirsten and Nola, have mentioned around collaboration, RD&D, and engagement. And I think that those are additional dimensions that we're starting to think about that complement the technology aspect. So staffing and training internally, government and employee and community engagement are vital aspects of their strategy. Really understanding what phasing will look like and partnerships and lobbying looks like. So at any rate, to bring that together, we're going to be scrutinizing the detail of the plans themselves and the technologies which will be funded, but we're also wanting to start to really understand almost the leading indicator about management and leadership competence in implementing the plan that's being presented.
Thanks, Chriselle. That was super insightful, and I would love to spend more time talking about this, but I think in the interest of time, I'm going to have to jump to our last question. And so this one is going to be for all of our panelists, but I will split this up. So I think firstly for Nola and Kirsten, can you share some of your success stories regarding the development and or implementation of your decarbonisation strategy? Nola, over to you first. Oh, Nola, you're on mute.
So I'm more cautious. So in terms of saying, you know, outright successes that I'm going to celebrate, I don't think we're there yet. As mentioned earlier in our discussion, unfortunately, in terms of our net zero strategy, we've gone in the wrong direction. And that has been for a number of reasons. The organization is growing quite massively. And then, as I mentioned earlier, things such as the infrastructure failures and the increasing requirements for diesel generation and the constraints we have to access renewable energies is a challenge for us. Having said that, the solution that we are working on in partnership with Eskom and with various municipalities in terms of the virtual wheeling platform, I think, you know, it's currently in a pilot phase and they're testing. If that gets right, it's something which I think we're going to be very proud of, because as I mentioned, and it is about taking the country forward and about taking, you know, the whole of the corporates, or should I say galvanizing other corporates and enabling and creating a platform for them to go forward. I think the microgrids, which we are also piloting, are very exciting because of the social and economic benefits that they're going to deliver. In terms of our funding strategy, just to quickly put my toe in that water, how we are looking at funding is we've actually brought together multiple aspects when we're raising funds. So that includes the renewable energy as well as rural access, provision of financial services, so that we can create an ecosystem impact across the areas in which we are operating. So yeah, early days for us. I think hopefully in a year I will have more that I can say that we are definitely celebrating, but definitely looking forward to embedding some of the solutions. And then I guess the longer term and the challenge is, as Kirsten mentioned earlier, for example, about the supply chain for alternative fuels. Those are definitely things which we would like to be celebrating in the near future, but we are appreciating that it's going to take a bit of time.
No, absolutely, that's fair. And from a collaboration perspective, it certainly is sounding promising already. Kirsten, over to you.
Yeah, same as Nola. I don't think we're in a position at this point in time to claim great victories, right? We're all on a journey, and we're definitely on our side. We're not there yet, far from it. We're in a process of implementing a strategy. At the same time, Well, a few things. I think the fact that we do now have a clear roadmap in place and have a strategy for every part of our business to significantly reduce at least our direct emissions, I think is a big step forward. In addition, the fact that we have, with great help from Carbon Trust, I have to say, mapped out our Scope 3 emissions over the last year and have now set a target. So have included, we started SBS with a target for Scope 1 and 2 carbon neutrality, and we have now very much included Scope 3, have started engagement with our stakeholders on that in our value chain, and have really integrated that in our strategy, because we feel that that's part of the deal. I think is a really important piece of the puzzle. And there's lots of very large infrastructural renewable energy projects under development. The fact that we are partnering with Anglo American in their renewable energy partnership and developing large scale wind energy in Namibia, solar and wind in South Africa is definitely a big step forward. It's not there yet. At the same time, almost all of our business units, from London to Singapore to Botswana, have installed rooftop solar. And when you come to the bigger emissions of the organization, that is a drop in the ocean. But in terms of visibility, in terms of people being able to see that that's where the energy comes from, and that you have, like, at the entrance of the office, people can see, like, okay, we've generated this much energy, we've saved this much greenhouse gas emissions per day, is an important step forward to make sure that everybody needs to do that a little bit. So I do celebrate all those smaller projects, if you like, because I see them as a step forward towards the newer, bigger, more effective pieces of the puzzle. So I think those are some of the successes. The fact that we have a clear vision on where we need to go, the fact that we have committed to set science-based targets, and that we're waiting for validation. But I think that is an important step for us as well, to really say, okay, we really want to adhere to what science tells us and go with what is at the moment, I think, that the most prominent standard for corporate climate targets out there is important for us. So small victories on a still fairly complex journey, but we'll get there.
Thanks, Kirsten. And I know you say that you might refer to them as being small, but I think those are really massive, and just having that clarity in that direction is already leaps ahead of many others. Great. So, Christel, going to maybe ask you what you think some of the success factors are that are critical for green and transition financing, for project implementation, etc.
Renata, I almost want to take it one step back or one step up. And I think I'm going to partly echo what I said a little bit earlier, which was touching on competency and credibility. I think that there is something to be had in thinking about how the TCFD pillars, for instance, are structured, right? And that our maturity journey ourselves in terms of changing of perspectives and understanding that framework as a guiding frame for how we go about things. If you think just about metrics and we were just reporting, then we started to look at risk and understanding what's going to put our businesses at stake. And then we're talking about strategy and having a very sort of positive orientation towards change. I think the next frontier and ultimately a crucial success factor is governance. And that's, I guess, what I touched on earlier as well. So that G in ESG, which is not standalone, but intertwined into these particular issues. And the effectiveness of business leaders to be able to enable their management and their employees, and to steward their organizations towards this change that we're all talking about. I think it's going to be a fundamental aspect. And I'm not just talking about policies on websites, I'm talking about trickle-through processes that really give the endorsement, the support to capital, and the commitments that are needed to be able to accelerate through these processes. I think the other part of the ESG aspect and thinking about governance is that S part. And that's the next frontier, really, around engagement and how we take on the journey of transition alongside with us. And so that's very big picture, I understand. But when we're thinking about success factors, if organizations that we work with today are really starting to unpack those issues, then they've set themselves on a journey which is much more holistic and robust for the challenges that are going to come down the road as they progress their transition processes.
That's super, Christelle. Thank you so much. And I think, as you mentioned, and as all of our panelists have been alluding to, is just what a holistic journey this does need to be. So thank you so much. And then I think lastly, Arvana, if you could share some success stories from financing low carbon transitions, and also if you have any success factors that you want to share that you think are critical for green and transition financing.
Sure, thanks. And Renata, maybe I'll hone in on an example where we effectively structured and issued a green residential development bond. And effectively, how this started was our point of departure saying, look, what is the need? What is the need that we need to solve for? And we're always looking for sustainable economic growth. And in the context of an economy where we know that we have electricity challenges, and we know that pockets are under pressure, specifically where you're exposed to inflationary increases from Eskom. We said, look, how can we actually start supporting the residential development market in a manner that will, first of all, provide more stock to consumers? So at the moment, there's a lot of brown building options as opposed to green building options. And how can we incentivize our developers to actually go and build green, because it is costly to do. You know, there is a cost to actually go and build a building with the green elements, which is much more than just building a normal traditional vanilla brown building. So what we did was we partnered with the likes of the IFC, being a developmental financial institution. But more than that, we also then managed to scale participation to commercial investors and effectively raise R1 billion, just over R1 billion, and ultimately be able to deploy that to our residential developers. Now, in addition to the financing, there was a training component associated with that from the likes of the Excellence in Design and Green Efficiencies program, which is also introduced to us. And what that does is, instead of just providing the financing to developers, we're also now rolling out training via that particular program to empower them to actually be able to build green. And I think that's a very important part of any transition to ensure that the technical aspects are there to actually enable the guys on the ground to implement. And then also we, you know, through the IFC, we've been able to mobilize donor money from the UK and effectively bring in a blend finance part. And this was all through Nedbank being the trusted partner and trusted coordinator and structurer to be able to bring these pots of liquidity together. And effectively now, in addition to just providing financing for development, we are able to mobilize a blend financing to these developers to cover the cost of going green. So I think that for me was a very successful example, and it's more transactions like that that we'd like to replicate in the market to the extent that those type of funding is available and can be channeled to us as a bank and structured. But I think if you move away from the DFI and blended finance, which that example, even if you just look at it on a purely commercial finance basis, you know, some of the KPIs that we've been adopting, we worked with one of the diamond companies as well in the Southern African region, and we looked at bioremediation, for example, and effectively bringing that in as a KPI, where that helped to improve the quality of nitrate concentrate in the water, for example. So I think the ambit is really big in terms of what KPIs we can look to include. And we just got to make sure together with our clients to calibrate it in a manner that is practical for them, but it's also ambitious enough to actually enable our clients to raise more funding and get more leverage out of the pricing that they could potentially obtain.
Thank you so much for sharing those really interesting examples. I think it's certainly been a really valuable discussion on actioning net zero and the impacts on potential financing. So I just want to thank all of our panelists for all of the insights shared. Before we do wrap up, I want to just hand over again to each of our panelists one last time for any quick reactions on the information shared today or any closing messages. So I'll start with Arvana and then go over to Christelle, then Nola, and lastly to Kirsten. So Arvana.
Thanks. I think all of us on this call would probably agree that this is not an easy task. It really is challenging and really is complex. but keeping that purpose at heart in terms of learning as we're going, but ultimately having the same vision in mind, I think is really going to help the cause. There is a lot of fragmentation and polarization in the space. And I think as long as we stay true to that cause and ultimately create those impacts in a sustainable way, that ultimately is where we want to be for the country and for every kind of operating entity. Thanks.
Thanks, Arana. Christelle.
Great, thanks. And I'll add to that. For me, I mean, a large part of this is collaboration, right? For many of our client bases, especially the MSMEs, they haven't previously been tooled up or had the resources at their capacity to be able to tool up. And those pressures are starting to drive through for them as well in emerging markets. And they have a vital role to play in transition for their economies and green growth. And so from that perspective, collaboration has a dual benefit of access to information, sort of accelerating their own role and their own engagement in this subject matter. And of course, those majors and those actors, such as those on the line that have taken those steps preemptively and have really forged pathways, make those pathways easier to walk for MSMEs coming in their wake. So again, collaboration, knowledge sharing, thought leadership is so fundamental.
Thanks, Christelle. Nola.
Yeah, so I think for me, building on what's already been said is the need to have everybody behind this, understanding where we're trying to go to, and ensuring you've got the right skills and tools in place. I think that and that organizational change that Kirsten mentioned, if it's not there, we're going to be a lot of passionate individuals who believe in the right thing, but you're not going to get very far, and it's going to feel very much like we're banging our heads against a brick wall. And then the other thing which I love to hear in almost every response, it's that collaboration and looking at it from an ecosystem perspective. So while we are working on net zero, everybody has mentioned communities, small and medium enterprises. Kirsten brought in the very important elements of women and bringing them into the STEM environment, creating new job opportunities in areas where there's low employment. So for me, it's that looking at it holistically and making sure that it is really a just transition as we're progressing. And I guess I'm saying this more to myself because I think it is a daunting task. It's just we can't give up. It's not an option. It may be slow going. We operate in Africa, which has many, many challenges in this. But I often spend time, and one of the organizations I follow is WEF, and they post those little videos of different innovations around the world, which just constantly gives me hope in terms of the fact that there's lots of creative and people who are filled with energy, and that there is a solution to be found, and we are going to get there.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Nola. And Kirsten.
Thanks so much. And yeah, fully agree, obviously, with what everybody else has said. And building on that, it's my pet peeve in the debate, and it's even the title of this event, right? Net zero. That too often, I think the debate around corporate climate action or climate investment even is limited to the numbers, right? It's like, what are your emission data? While, as we've spoken here, it is about stakeholder engagement, it is about the just transition, it is about innovation, it's about jobs and opportunities and how whatever we do connects to other parts of the sustainability journey. And we somehow need to do more to get that message and that story out there, because I think it is a very important piece of what we do. And at the same time, we get bogged down to just reporting on the exact numbers and not delivering on those numbers. And we're trying, but I think there's a lot more to a corporate climate journey and to green investments as well than just bringing emission numbers down. That needs to happen. That is obviously crucial, but there's a lot more to it. And I think by calling it a net zero journey or a carbon neutral journey, etc., we are not doing justice to all the work that needs to be done. Let me leave it at that.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kirsten. So I think some really valuable messages and really key themes that have been discussed today. But unfortunately, it does bring us to the end of our session. So just thank you again to our panelists for being part of this discussion and providing such valuable insights on your decarbonisation journeys, how you've been managing this transition and the financing of this transition, and for sharing examples of how you believe net zero can be achieved, or at least the steps to achieve it, and some of those success factors needed to make it happen. So thank you also to all of our listeners for attending. I hope that you did enjoy the session, and I'll now hand back to Ralph to introduce the next speaker. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you to the whole panel. And Nola, yes, I love the World Economic Forum videos as well. So hopefully we'll be able to produce a few more of those about the journey. We'll be back shortly when Geraldine Morris will join me to look at the highlights from today and what happens next. Click on the Up Next button on your screen and we'll see you shortly. Welcome back. What a conference. So many stories and ideas. If you're wondering where to go next, you're in the right place because Geraldine Morris is here from the Carbon Trust in South Africa. Geraldine, welcome. Some really interesting insights and discussion. I wonder, what did you take away from today's event?
Thanks, Ralph. Yes, I am, as you said, joining from quite a hot Johannesburg today. So I've got a few remarks just to cover off, and I wanted to start by thanking the Carbon Trust CEO, Tom DeLay, our very insightful keynote speaker, Dr. Crispian Ulver from the Presidential Climate Commission, all of the brilliant panelists and moderators, you, Ralph, our wonderful host, and also all of those of you who have been watching and participating in the questions and answers. I think my leading takeaway from today is the critical need to accelerate our efforts for all of the reasons that we do know about. So the climatic reasons, but I think, as was highlighted, also the economic and social as well as developmental success in terms of South Africa in particular, but I'm sure true for many of you if you're listening from elsewhere in the globe. And also that I think fundamentally this pathway, be it towards simply a decarbonization pathway or a specific net zero pathway with a particular date in mind, creates an opportunity. And I think for me, it's heartening to see the framing from a lot of the panelists today that this is indeed an opportunity, though not easy. And I think some of the keywords that came up across today's session for me, or both sessions rather, was that this journey needs commitment, collaboration, and innovation from across all the role players in society. So from our policymakers, certainly, and influencers of policy, to those on the ground, like the corporates and the financial institutions who are driving the change. I think also the diversity of needs must be complemented by the diversity of skills. And here, Carbon Trust has a good, or comes from a strong place, rather, should I say, to be a partner to those of you on your journey to accelerating net zero through pragmatic, practical solutions and planning. And again, a lot of those sort of key themes coming through today, that those are the needs in accelerating this journey. We heard from Dr. Ulver about the unique circumstances of South Africa. So he framed the country's decarbonization aspirations, as well as our economic challenges and socioeconomic challenges as a country, and critically the just transition imperatives of the national response in terms of our aspirations and decarbonization goals, as well as the importance of positioning the response that we take as a country within the context of these developmental challenges. And I think our first panel really started teasing out some of these considerations in terms of what they mean for corporates, and critically the role of corporates in ensuring that we achieve a just transition towards this low carbon economy. Nicola Martins highlighted the importance of framing the shift again in the context of opportunity, so that came through quite strongly. And then Dr. Amal Lee pointing out the importance of the engagements with local and affected communities, again in terms of leveraging these as opportunities, and opportunities again for all stakeholders involved. This working with and walking with stakeholders along the journey, which is paramount to the success. The role of policy was highlighted also in the first panel in terms of providing guidance to the private sector. Vicky had also referred to the work that her organization, the World Benchmarking Alliance, had done. They issued their leading report in 2021, the Just Transition Assessment, which also found the fundamental success of a just transition to be based again on this collaboration with workers, communities, and policymakers, and so forth. I think a key takeaway from that first panel was that the companies really should look at this journey in a holistic manner and integrate the necessary transparency and target setting into their business as a core component thereof, and not simply as an environmental concern. Also interesting for me and heartening to hear some of the comments about the responsibility towards workers, even looking outside of one sector, and the need for that real world impact and those practical solutions. Annika Land also spoke to the critical need for data, but I think my ears really pricked up at the mention that she made of public-private partnerships, which in my opinion is a critical lever needed in South Africa's journey. She also spoke, Vicky, also spoke about the need for an enabling policy environment. And these are my kind of pet areas of work. So these statements really resonated with me. I think in terms of the second panel, there was a lot of similarities. So Kristen Hund highlighted the insights from De Beers' journey, demonstrating the importance again of internal collaboration and integration for organizational change. Some of the further examples and critical learnings that were shared by Nola Richards on the importance of ensuring that organizations have the right team and skills to implement the change. And again, highlighted the role of innovation in implementing the change and leveraging the scalability. So here again, this really critical role of collaboration and partnerships and integrating this throughout the organization, but also along the value chains, which featured quite strongly in some of the discussions. Christelle emphasized the role of blended finance in driving innovation for technologies needed for the change. And then Arvana from Nedbank sort of led off from this point to the role of innovative finance packages that could then galvanize further information and respond to the market needs more dynamically. And I think what I took away from a lot of these discussions is whether developmental or commercial financiers are looking for transparency and credible strategies and targets to enable them, I suppose, to give provision for the financing. As well, I think, as the bona fides that these organizations can effectively implement these plans. And here again, collaboration featured strongly, this time collaboration between potential funders and those seeking funds. Another critical point raised was the role that corporates and corporate leaders have to play in leading and in the stewardship for the future. And again, I think this is a really key message and a strong message that comes through. Again, it was emphasized that this is a journey, both I think from a financial point of view and an implementation point of view. And again, Carbon Trust very well placed to partner with potential corporates on these journeys. I know the Africa team is looking forward to continuing our work with some of the clients, some of whom featured in our discussions today. So those across and beyond those who have joined the call today and the sectors involved today. I personally have thoroughly enjoyed today's engagement and the insights that were shared, and I hope that all of the participants and our audience have too. Carbon Trust has hosted a series of these Accelerate to Net Zero events across the regions that we operate, culminating in Africa and Latin America events today. We've held events in China, Europe, Southeast Asia, and the UK. And the recordings from all of our events will be available on our website as well as our YouTube channel in the coming days. And I encourage all of you to please go and take a look at the events from across some of the international perspectives. I'd like to end off by once again thanking you all for attending, thanking our keynote speaker, all of our other speakers and panelists, our moderators, hosts, and importantly, our Marcoms team, without whom this would not have been possible today. This has been a truly inspiring event. I'm wishing you all a very good year ahead and the best for your journeys to net zero.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. As you said, All of the videos will be available on the YouTube channel and on the website. There is one more event in this series, so if you'd like to hear from another region, Latin America starts in about 2 hours' time. Actually, I think it's about 90 minutes' time. You'll find the details on how to join on our website under events. That's also where you'll find the information about joining up for the newsletters, looking at other people's stories, and also some of the insights as well. If you follow us on LinkedIn, you will see some of the sound bites, if you like, the little digestible news nuggets about what's going on in the industry. There was a great one the other day about the fashion industry and how their progress towards net zero is going. So for now, from the whole of the Carbon Trust team, thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon.